On the morning of September 20, 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman sat down and wrote a letter to Ulysses Grant that Washington was never supposed to see. Atlanta had fallen 18 days earlier. The city was in Union hands, the rail hub of the Deep South was gone, and the Confederacy's ability to move men and materiel across Georgia had been severed at its center. By every conventional measure of the war, Sherman had just achieved something significant. He was supposed to consolidate, resupply, and wait for further orders. He was not interested in waiting. The letter he wrote that morning ran several pages and contained an argument that had no precedent in the entire history of the war. He did not want to chase John Bell Hood's Confederate Army of Tennessee north into the hills. He did not want to hold Atlanta and wait for a counterattack. He did not want to do anything that Washington expected him to do or that the conventional military logic of 1864 could have predicted. What he wanted to do was cut his telegraph wire to Washington, abandon his supply line entirely, and march 60,000 men east through the heart of Georgia to the sea. He wanted to walk through the Confederacy like it was already dead. The argument he laid out for Grant in that letter, and in the letters that followed it through September and October, was not simply a proposal for a bold military maneuver. It was a diagnosis of the war itself, a claim about what the Confederacy actually was and what it would actually take to end it. And it was a claim that the men in Washington, the men with the authority to approve or deny it, did not have the strategic imagination to understand. Grant heard it, Washington didn't. That gap between the general in the field who could see what needed to happen and the government in Washington that could not, is the story this video is about. And before it's over, you'll understand why the plan that terrified Washington delivered the most decisive and cost-efficient strategic result of the entire war. If this kind of history lands for you, hit like and subscribe. It helps keep the channel going. To understand what Sherman was warning Grant about, you have to understand what kind of mind was doing the warning. William Tecumseh Sherman was born in Lancaster, Ohio, in February of 1820. His father died when he was 9, and he was taken in by the family of Thomas Ewing, a prominent Ohio politician who would eventually serve as Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of War. Sherman grew up in a household where politics and power were the daily furniture of life, which gave him an early and lasting education in the gap between what institutions say they are doing and what they are actually doing. He went to West Point, graduated 6th in the class of 1840, and went into the artillery. He served in Florida during the Second Seminole War and in California during the Mexican War, not in the main theater, not at Cerro Gordo or Chapultepec where Grant and Lee and McClellan were making names for themselves, but in the administrative and logistical work that teaches an officer different things than battlefield gallantry does. He learned supply. He learned terrain. He learned what armies actually need to function over distance and time, as opposed to what they need to win a single engagement. He left the army in 1853 and spent the next 8 years failing at almost everything he tried, banking in San Francisco during the financial panic of 1857, law in Kansas, briefly and unsuccessfully. He became superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning, the institution that would eventually become LSU, and was genuinely good at it, genuinely respected by the faculty and students, genuinely content in a way he had not been before. And then Louisiana seceded, and he resigned, and the war that had been building for a decade arrived all at once. His early war record was troubled. He commanded a brigade at First Bull Run and held his men together better than most, but First Bull Run was a Union disaster that shook nearly everyone who was part of it. He was given command in Kentucky in the fall of 1861, and there he made the mistake that would follow him for years. He told his superiors, honestly and accurately, how many men he thought he would need to hold the Western Theater. The number was large. His superiors thought he was exaggerating. The Cincinnati Commercial published a report calling him insane. He was briefly relieved and spent several weeks in what his letters to his wife Ellen describe as a period of genuine psychological collapse, not breakdown as metaphor, but as documented reality, a period of sleeplessness, despair, and an inability to function that he acknowledged privately and that his enemies used against him publicly for the rest of the war. He was rehabilitated under Grant. Shiloh, in April of 1862, was where the rehabilitation was completed. Sherman's division held the Union right on the first day of that battle under conditions that broke other units around him, and when Grant looked at what had held and what had broken, Sherman's name was attached to what had held. From that point forward, the two men were bound together by something that was not merely professional. It was the specific bond that forms between men who have been in genuine danger together and discovered what the other is made of. By the fall of 1864, Sherman commanded the military division of the Mississippi, the entire Western Theater. He had just completed one of the most sustained operational campaigns of the war, driving Joseph Johnston and then John Bell Hood back from Chattanooga to Atlanta over 4 months and 300 miles of Georgia and Tennessee. He had done it without the kind of massive set-piece battles that characterized the Eastern Theater. He had done it through maneuver, through flanking, through the relentless pressure of an army that was always moving and never where its opponent expected it. And now Atlanta had fallen, and Sherman was sitting in the city looking east toward the coast, and what he saw was not a military problem. It was a political and psychological one, and he had a solution. The strategic debate of September and October 1864 is the intellectual core of this story, and it deserves to be laid out clearly, because what Sherman was arguing was considerably more radical than it sounds at first. The conventional military logic of the era said, find the enemy's army, engage it, destroy it, and the war ends. This was how wars had been understood and fought for as long as anyone in the Army of the Potomac or the Army of Northern Virginia had been alive. It was the logic behind Grant's overland campaign in Virginia, find Lee, stay on Lee, bleed Lee until there was nothing left. It was the logic behind every general in Washington who looked at Hood's Confederate Army of Tennessee moving north and said, pursue it, destroy it. That's what you do. Sherman's argument was that this logic was wrong, not wrong in general, correct for Virginia, correct for the Eastern Theater where Lee's army was the Confederacy's center of gravity, but wrong for Georgia, wrong for the Deep South, wrong for the specific problem Sherman was facing in the fall of 1864. His argument had 3 parts, and all 3 of them appear in the documented letters he wrote to Grant during this period. First, Hood's army was not the Confederacy's center of gravity in the Western Theater. The Confederacy's ability to continue fighting in the West depended not on Hood's army specifically, but on Georgia's economic infrastructure, its railroads, its food supply, its manufacturing capacity, and on the willingness of the Southern civilian population to go on supporting the war. Destroy Hood's army, and the Confederacy would raise another. Destroy Georgia's railroads and supply base, and the Confederacy's logistical capacity in the entire Western Theater collapses. The targets were different, and the army was chasing the wrong one. Second, the Southern civilian population had been insulated from the direct experience of the war for 3 years. Georgia, the Carolinas, the Deep South interior had contributed men and supplies to Confederate armies without ever seeing a Union soldier. The farms were producing, the railroads were running. The civilian population remained psychologically committed to the Confederate cause partly because they had never been given a reason to doubt that the Confederate government could protect them. Sherman's argument, and this is the part Washington was least equipped to hear, was that demonstrating the Confederate government's inability to protect its own civilian population was itself a military objective, as important as destroying any specific army or capturing any specific city. If his army could walk through the heart of Georgia, eat the food, burn the railroads, and leave whenever it chose, with nothing Hood or Davis or anyone else could do to stop it, then every person in the South who saw or heard about it would have to reckon with a simple fact. The Confederacy cannot protect you. That reckoning, Sherman believed, would break civilian morale and the willingness to continue the war more effectively than any battlefield victory. Third, and this was the argument Washington found most alarming, the supply line was not a vulnerability. It was unnecessary. Georgia was rich enough to feed 60,000 men for a month. The foraging system Sherman had developed over 2 years of Western campaigning could sustain his army off the land without a single supply wagon coming from the north. The absence of a supply line was not recklessness. It was the point. Confederate cavalry couldn't interdict what wasn't there. The army would become, in effect, self-sufficient and unstoppable. Sherman wrote to Grant on September 20th, laying out the substance of this plan. He wrote again on October 9th, pressing harder, making the case more explicitly. The documented phrase from his letters that historians have cited most often, the line that captures the spirit of what he was proposing, was this: he could make Georgia howl. That phrase is from his September 9th letter to Grant, written in the immediate aftermath of Atlanta's fall. It is authentic, widely verified, and it says in 4 words what it took Sherman several letters to fully argue, that the target of the march was not Hood's army. It was Georgia itself, its infrastructure, its confidence, its will. Grant's response during this period is documented in his own letters and in his memoirs, and it is not the immediate enthusiastic endorsement that popular accounts sometimes suggest. Grant pushed back. He was specifically concerned about the supply line, about what happened if Sherman's army ran into serious resistance somewhere in the Georgia interior with no way to receive reinforcements and no way to communicate with Washington. He was also concerned about Hood. If Sherman marched east and Hood moved north into Tennessee unchecked, what was to stop him from rolling up the Union position in the Western Theater from behind? Sherman's answer to the Hood question was George Thomas. He proposed to leave Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, the Union's most reliable defensive commander, in Tennessee with sufficient force to handle Hood. The Army of the Cumberland under Thomas, Sherman argued, was more than adequate to deal with Hood without Sherman's involvement. Grant heard this argument and kept thinking about it. He kept asking questions. He kept pushing back on specific points. And in the background of all this correspondence, Washington was doing something different. Washington was refusing to engage with the argument at all. Henry Halleck, the Army Chief of Staff, filed his objections through official channels. His concerns were procedural and logistical: the supply line risk, the communication blackout, the exposed flanks of a column moving through hostile territory without fixed points of support. These were not unreasonable concerns by the military standards of 1864. But they were the concerns of a man applying conventional military logic to an unconventional military problem, which is exactly what Halleck had been doing for the entire war, and exactly why Grant and Sherman had both learned to work around him wherever possible. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was similarly skeptical. He had his own reasons for distrusting Sherman, a complicated history of bureaucratic friction and competing authority claims, and his skepticism about the March plan had that history mixed into it. Lincoln himself was documented as uneasy. He said, in communications during this period, that he was anxious, if not fearful, about the plan. But Lincoln, unlike Halleck and Stanton, understood one thing clearly: he would not override Grant's and Sherman's military judgment. If Grant approved the plan, Lincoln would defer. That restraint, that willingness to trust the generals in the field against the anxieties of the men in Washington, was one of the things that made Lincoln different from the men around him. Grant approved the plan in late October 1864. The condition he extracted was the one Sherman had already anticipated. Thomas had to have enough men to handle Hood before Sherman cut loose. Sherman agreed. Thomas got his forces. Sherman began his preparations. On November 15, 1864, Sherman's army marched out of Atlanta. He cut the telegraph wire to Washington. From that moment until he reached Savannah in December, no one in Washington, not Lincoln, not Halleck, not Stanton, knew where he was, what he had encountered, or whether 60,000 men had simply vanished into Georgia. The 36 days between November 15th and December 21st, 1864, deserve to be understood for what they were from Washington's perspective: a complete communication blackout with the largest Union army in the Western Theater. Lincoln was managing a war on multiple fronts. Grant was pinned down outside Petersburg, bleeding Lee's army in a siege that showed no sign of imminent resolution. The political situation, while improved by Atlanta's fall in September and by Lincoln's re-election in November, was still fragile in ways that anyone who understood the Northern public's war weariness could see clearly. And somewhere in Georgia, 60,000 Union soldiers were marching through Confederate territory without a supply line, without communication, without any ability to call for help if something went badly wrong. The anxiety in Washington was real and documented. Halleck continued to express concerns through official channels. Stanton watched the telegraph for dispatches that did not come. Lincoln kept his counsel and trusted the judgment he had deferred to. Inside Georgia, the march was proceeding exactly as Sherman had said it would. Army moved in 4 corps, organized into 2 wings. The right wing was the Army of the Tennessee under Oliver Howard. The left wing was the Army of Georgia under Henry Slocum. They moved on parallel roads, covering roughly 10 to 15 miles a day, foraging off the countryside through the system Sherman had developed and refined over 2 years of Western campaigning. The authorized foraging parties, the men who came to be called bummers, stripped farms of food, livestock, and fodder in the Army's path. Sherman's orders explicitly prohibited the burning of private homes. The documented record makes clear that these orders were frequently violated in practice. The march was not an atrocity by the standards of total war, but it was not the clean, surgical infrastructure campaign that Sherman's letters described either. It was an army of 60,000 men moving through a farming society and consuming everything it needed, which left a mark on the landscape and the people in it that the survivors of that winter never forgot. Confederate resistance was minimal in exactly the way Sherman had predicted. Wheeler's Confederate cavalry harassed the flanks of the column but could not stop it, slow it significantly, or threaten it with anything approaching serious danger. The Georgia militia, the only substantial Confederate ground force available in the interior, numbered roughly 10,000 men against 60,000 Union veterans hardened by 2 years of the Western campaigns. There was no pitched battle. There was no crisis moment where the march nearly failed. The army moved, foraged, destroyed railroad track, and moved again. Railroad destruction was systematic and complete. Sherman's men had developed a technique for making railroad iron permanently unusable, heating the rails over burning crosties and then bending them around trees, creating shapes that came to be called Sherman's neckties. Approximately 300 miles of track were destroyed during the march, cutting the Western and Atlantic, the central of Georgia, and connecting lines that had been the logistical spine of the Confederate war effort in the Deep South. Rebuilding them would take months and resources the Confederacy no longer had. On December 21, 1864, Confederate General William Hardee evacuated Savannah rather than allow his 10,000 men to be trapped by Sherman's converging forces. Sherman occupied the city intact, and then he sent the telegram that Washington had been waiting 36 days to receive. He sent it to Lincoln. He said he begged to present the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift. The plan that Halleck had filed objections against, the plan that Stanton had doubted, the plan that had made Lincoln anxious, if not fearful. That plan had just marched 60,000 men through the heart of the Confederacy in 36 days, destroyed 300 miles of railroad, consumed or eliminated an estimated $100 million in Confederate property and infrastructure, reached the coast intact, and captured a major southern port city, at a casualty rate that, by the standards of this war, was almost astonishingly low. Washington had been wrong, the generals in the field had been right, and the specific gap between what Sherman had argued in his September and October letters and what Washington had been capable of hearing across that distance had just been resolved, definitively and permanently, by 36 days of marching through Georgia. The aftermath of the march is where the significance of what Sherman had warned comes into focus most clearly. George Thomas destroyed Hood's Army of Tennessee at the Battle of Nashville on December 15th and 16th, running simultaneously with Sherman's arrival at Savannah, validating the second half of Sherman's argument with the same completeness that the march had validated the first. Hood's army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Thomas had handled it exactly as Sherman predicted he would. The Western theater, which had consumed 3 years and hundreds of thousands of lives, was effectively over. Sherman turned his army north into the Carolinas in early 1865. The march through the Carolinas was harder than Georgia. The terrain was more difficult, the weather was worse, and the Confederate resistance was marginally more organized. But the strategic logic was the same, and the outcome followed the same pattern. The Confederacy's ability to supply Lee in Virginia depended on the rail lines running north from Georgia and the Carolinas. Sherman was destroying them methodically, cutting Lee's army off from the Deep South's resources with every mile he marched. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. Joseph Johnston surrendered to Sherman at Durham Station on April 26. The war was over. The historical argument about what ended it, Grant's grinding campaign against Lee in Virginia, or Sherman's destruction of the Confederacy's economic base from the inside, is still debated by historians and probably always will be. What is not debatable is that Sherman had identified, in his September and October letters to Grant, a strategic reality that the men in Washington could not see and would not have authorized if Grant had not overridden their caution. The Confederacy was not simply an army. It was a society that had organized itself for war, and that society's willingness to continue organizing itself for war depended on two things: its economic infrastructure and its civilian population's belief that the Confederate government could protect them. Sherman had seen this clearly in September of 1864, when Washington was still thinking about Hood's army. He had written it down, he had sent it to Grant, he had pressed the case across weeks of correspondence against resistance from the most powerful military bureaucracy in Washington. And then, when Grant approved the plan and Sherman cut the telegraph and disappeared into Georgia, what he was really doing, beneath the logistics and the foraging system and the railroad destruction, was proving the argument, proving it physically, undeniably, in a way that every newspaper in the North and every parlor in the South would have to reckon with. The Confederate government could not protect Georgia. It could not stop 60,000 men from walking through the heart of its territory, eating its food, destroying its railroads, and arriving at the coast whenever they chose. Washington had spent 6 weeks not knowing whether that proof would be delivered. Lincoln had been anxious, if not fearful. Halleck had filed his objections. Stanton had kept his doubts. They had been wrong, and they had been wrong in a specific way. They had applied the military thinking of 1861 to a war that had evolved into something 1861 had no framework to describe. Sherman had a framework. He had written it down in September, pressed it in October, and marched it into reality in November and December. The warning Washington refused to hear became the plan that ended the war. There is one more thing worth saying about Sherman before this video ends, because it sits just below the surface of everything the march accomplished and is rarely stated directly. Sherman was not a man who forgot being called insane. The Cincinnati commercial piece from 1861, the report that described him as mentally unfit for command, that was reprinted across the Northern press, that contributed to his temporary relief from command, and the weeks of genuine psychological collapse that followed, that piece was still in circulation when Sherman was planning the march to the sea. The journalist who had written it was still working. The institutional memory of Sherman's breakdown was still present in Washington's assessment of him. When Halleck expressed skepticism about the march plan, and when Stanton doubted it, and when Lincoln was anxious, they were not assessing the plan entirely in the abstract. They were assessing it through the filter of a general whose fitness for independent command the press had publicly questioned 3 years earlier. Sherman knew this. He could not have been unaware of it, and the silence he imposed, cutting the telegraph, disappearing into Georgia, removing himself from Washington's ability to second-guess or interfere, was not just an operational decision. It was the decision of a man who understood, from hard experience, that the people in Washington who doubted him were not going to stop doubting him until he showed them something they could not argue with. He showed them Savannah. The Christmas telegram is usually read as a general's wit. the clever gift-giving frame on a military dispatch. It was that. But it was also the closing line of an argument that had begun in September, that Washington had refused to hear, and that 36 days of marching through Georgia had settled without any further discussion required. Grant heard the warning. Washington didn't. And the general who had been called insane walked 60,000 men to the sea and handed Lincoln a city for Christmas. History has given Sherman's march a name. It has given it monuments and museums, and a place in the military history curriculum of every serious institution that teaches the American Civil War. What it has not always given it is the credit that belongs specifically to the argument Sherman made in the fall of 1864, the argument that the war could be won not by destroying Hood's army, but by demonstrating to the Confederate civilian population that their government could not protect them. That argument was not obvious. It was not conventional. It was not what Washington wanted to hear in September of 1864, when the men in the War Department were still thinking about armies rather than about the society that was sustaining them. It was right, and the man who made it had been trying to make it, in one form or another, since the war began, waiting for a commanding general who was capable of hearing it. He found one, and together they ended the war.